Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's STC Roundtable webinar, Future-Proof Your Dock, Keeping Docks Accurate with Continuous Delivery. Today's webinar is presented by Scott Abel and Meredith Volk. Scott, I will now turn it over to you.
Hello, welcome. I'm Scott Abel, the Content Wrangler, today's show host. I'm excited to share with you this presentation from Meredith Volk. She's the Manager of Technical Content Strategy at identity management firm Sailpoint. Meredith's presentation is going to cover the topic of continuous delivery of technical content. So stay with us for this show to learn what continuous delivery means and why you should better understand it. You'll also discover what a context bucket is and why a content strategy mindset and changing the way you think about documentation are critical to your future success. All right, without further ado, let's welcome to the stage, our digital stage at least, our presenter, Meredith Volk. Meredith, are you on the line?
I am. Hi, everybody.
Excellent. Thanks for joining us today, making time and sharing what you've learned. I really appreciate it. In the interest of time, I'm going to put myself on mute and let you take away the show and show us what you can about this topic, and then we'll take questions from the audience, I believe, at the end of the show.
All right, sounds good. I'm going to warn y'all, I tend to speak quickly when I'm nervous. I'll do my best to control that impulse. My name is Meredith Volk. I'm the Manager of Technical Content Strategy at Sailpoint Technologies on our cloud product. I've been a technical writer since 1996, and I've worked on SaaS or cloud products since 2004. I'm currently part of a team of 4 writers, and we manage the work of 4 tribes of 3 scrums each who are developing varying degrees of engineering features that might impact our work. I want to emphasize that I am not a technical writer, and this is the nature of SaaS products and documentation versus on-premises products. We really focus on front-end visible behavior. There's a limited number of configurations that are allowed, and the assumption is that a customer doesn't need to understand back-end or architecture in order to be successful. So today I'm going to be talking about what Sailpoint does and why it's important to work with, to have a plan for continuous delivery, specifically for Sailpoint customers. I'm going to talk more about what continuous delivery actually is, how we use Jira to keep up with engineering, why a content strategy mindset is important, and the context bucket element of that is part of that topic. And finally, why creating a strong network with your other internal teams is an important part of being successful. So first, Sailpoint Solutions. We offer identity governance solutions. We have 2 platforms, both an on-premises platform called Identity IQ and our cloud platform called Identity Now. A lot of people, when they hear about identity governance, they immediately think about identity theft, and that's actually, we don't have anything to do with that. What we do is allow our companies to manage their employees' access to systems and data. Some examples of this would be preventing an accounts payable employee from also having accounts receivable access. So basically they can't buy whatever they want without having to go through any other kinds of approvals. We set up systems so that you can get your employees up and running on day 1 with all the access they need, in contrast to a lot of people's experience, including mine, where you start a job and at previous companies, I should say, where you start a job and it takes a week and a half or longer for you to get all of the applications and system access you need to do your work. We allow our customers to set up periodic reviews of access to make sure that employees have all the access they need and no access that's inappropriate. We set up systems for automating and securing ad hoc requests for applications so that that allows for self-service, and basically employees can operate more efficiently. And we support IT systems being able to establish systematic password management enforcement mechanisms, again, as part of a self-service offering to basically keep companies' operations running smoothly and reducing costs. And I'm mentioning this not to brag about what SailPoint does so much as to emphasize that when we introduce change into this environment, it's either going to be perceived as really valuable or traumatic. And our ability my team's ability to get the information about the change to the customers in appropriate time frame is an important part of making sure they get all of the value and none of the trauma. And so that's where understanding how continuous delivery affects that and how we work with it is an important part of making sure our customers stay successful. And so literally when my engineering manager came to me and told me that we were going to be moving to a continuous delivery mode, my jaw dropped and I couldn't believe that this was a real thing. And so I'm going to talk to you guys briefly about what it is and what it isn't. First, what it isn't is quarterly releases or monthly releases or even weekly releases. In short, when engineering work is done, it goes into production code and becomes visible to customers immediately. And I think that if you use any sort of consumer cloud apps, you may be familiar with some of this. Facebook might change an option and there's no notification about it. You just see that suddenly you can not just like something, but you can also add a smiley face or a sad face. So we're actually doing similar things, but it's a B2B system that is an integral part of our customers' IT systems. And so we can't just have these things pop up by surprise. But I want to talk a little bit more about continuous delivery and what it is and isn't. And I'm going to talk about it through the lens of pizza delivery. So if you think about engineering as, or a pizza as an analogy for delivering code, a quarterly release might be similar to a pizza party. You've got 8 or 10 solid, delicious pieces of engineering features that are being delivered in a quarterly release. And you might get a nice chunk of bugs, and that's often what a quarterly release looks like in a cloud product. A monthly release might look more like a pizza dinner. We've got 3 nice features that come in a month, maybe 2, sometimes maybe 4 a different time. And then a weekly release might look like an individual pizza. And so before I talk about what continuous delivery looks like in pizza terms, let's talk about reality at Identity Now. In October of 2017, we were releasing 19. We had 19 releases per week on average, and today we're averaging more like 40 releases a week. And the goal of the company is to more than double that. But I want to emphasize, and this is important for those of us who are writing documentation, 90% of those are not visible to customers. So we're not actually delivering 40 pizzas a week. What we are doing is something more like delivering ingredients and equipment and other underlying infrastructure, to jump out of the metaphor, in order to periodically release a pizza that is going to bring value to our customers. And we can talk a little bit more about that later, but I think it's important to remember that we're not being overwhelmed with content that needs to be documented. It's a little bit closer. In reality, it looks a little bit more like a weekly release than it does like I said, like we're delivering 40 items that a customer needs to be aware of every week. So I think it's important. Part of this presentation is to think about how far off this is for you. And I want to emphasize that when we have people come in for interviews at our company, not a lot of people have experience with continuous delivery. And what that means is that it's fairly far off for most people. It doesn't mean that it's not going to happen for you eventually, but I think it's important to remember that it's not something that's sort of breathing down your neck necessarily. If you're working on an on-premises product, it's not likely to happen. If you're working on a SaaS product that releases quarterly, you're easily a year or two away from any kind of continuous delivery. And if your product releases every month or 2 weeks, then you're closer than you might realize. And it's possible that some parts of your product are using continuous delivery model, but it's still, I want to emphasize that there's still a long on-ramp to getting to, for example, the 19 releases a week that we were at, or the 40 releases a week that we're at right now. So other than being aware that you're probably a long way off, I recommend taking a deep cleansing breath and then asking people. So asking your engineering managers, especially if you have a team that's dedicated to a platform or back-end work. It's also important to get to know your DevOps team and ask them both whether they're already doing continuous delivery or what the plans are. In general, it's a good idea to get to know more about how DevOps works. For those of you who aren't familiar with DevOps, these are engineers that work on the operations side. They work on tools and systems that manage the infrastructure that supports your software. They monitor performance, and they also are the ones who actually deploy the code into production. And so I highly recommend that you learn how they work now so that you're facing fewer surprises later on. As you get to know them, building relationships with them, including bringing them delicious foods, will help you have a better contact with them. We've literally been able to either convince them to delay a deployment where we needed to do some additional work before something went out, or in some cases just understanding their terminology and being able to check in with them to find out how far away a deployment was from being released. So for example, if something was, if it was late in the day and we were expecting something to go out soon, we could ask what their queue looked like and whether they expected it to go out before the end of the day or if it was more likely to go out in the morning. And that's where Jira really comes into play, because understanding how your team tracks releases now is definitely going to be helpful for you now and really in the future as you move towards continuous delivery. So the first thing that you may have gotten from my pizza ingredient slide is that we don't necessarily have a clear idea of when code that we wrote documentation for is going to go into production. We're typically working for toward a month or sometimes a quarter. If we're really lucky, then we get sort of a more constrained time frame, so the end of April, for example. This isn't an easy thing to do, but it is doable. We have a couple different ways to know when something is about to go to production, which I'll talk about in a second. It's also important to keep in mind that this content strategy mindset that I'll talk about more later helps us have our content ready in advance of the release, even if we don't know exactly when it's going to go out. So the two ways that we know if content is going to, or I'm sorry, if code is going to go to engineering, code is going to go to production are through a deployment ticket. And if code is being released via deployment ticket, it goes straight to production, or a feature flag. And a feature flag is actually really a writer's best friend in this environment. It's a cloaking device, and it actually allows engineering to add code in incremental chunks to production, but so that it's invisible to customers. And basically, when the entire set of ingredients, if you will, is in the right place, then they lift the cloaking device by turning the feature flag on, and customers have access to the feature that they've just released. And so what we do is we actually watch both the deployment tickets and the feature flags in Jira. If you're not familiar with Jira, there's actually a start watching and stop watching options on tickets. And as soon as something moves into a sort of pre-production state, then we we're on alert for it to go to production, and then we get a notification when it's quote unquote in prod is the status. And then we know that it's time to publish the documentation. And so we also talk to DevOps, obviously, to find out where things are in the queue when we know that they're coming up. And specifically with feature flags, the engineering team and the product management team check in with us before they turn a feature flag on to make sure that the documentation is ready, so that we are keeping oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, y'all. So that we are able to keep our customers informed and successful as we change their product. And so this is a good segue into sort of rethinking the way that we approach the content that we're writing. I think that until I moved to SailPoint, to Identity Now, it was typical to start writing when a feature went into test. And we can't do that anymore because testing in a continuous delivery environment is actually integrated into the development process. So we are no longer a follow-on to engineering work. We actually work in parallel with the engineers, and we've determined that there is actually plenty to do before the UI is finished in order to get our content in good shape. So I recommend that you start looking at tools and processes now, which I guess is part of what this webinar is about, and to literally start working on your content sooner. And that's really where content strategy mindset comes into play. We've really had to change the way that we think about documentation in order to keep up with the development cycle that happens here. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with content strategy, it's a pretty complex discipline, and I'm only going to focus on a few components of it today. It's this idea of guiding the creation, delivery, and governance of useful, usable content. It includes content design, which is getting the right information to the right people at the right time, and system design, which is defining tools and processes that make the work more efficient and effective. And it's that last part that we've really been working on that in a sense allows us to do the content design more effectively and quickly because of the way that we do our system design. So our tools include a documentation request queue in Jira, a Jira epic per doc request, and then our planning doc, which I like to call a context bucket, which is a combination of a content audit and a content inventory, which are some content strategy specific tools, plus some unique elements of our own devising. So the doc request queue really consists of a number of Jira tickets, and we're able to get our own issue type created called the IDN doc issue. This links to the engineering work item. The person who creates it should be identifying both the subject matter experts that we need to refer to and the priority of the items. We know how to balance it with the other items in the queue. They should be giving us a desired delivery date, which, as I said, is never a specific date, but the idea that we need to evaluate sort of an expected time frame against all the other expected time frames of the items that are in our queue. And then we also evaluate whether the content is sort of essential for a customer to stay successful. If we determine that missing content is going to cause our customer to fall down, then we would mark the issue as blocking deployment. And so here's an example of the doc request queue. I've masked some of the actual descriptions because these items are actually in flight right now. You can see that we have different priority settings for these. Some of these still need sizing, and I'll talk a little bit more about what a t-shirt size refers to later. We have desired delivery dates, and so we can sort of evaluate a delivery date and a size, ideally, with the priority, and sort of shift either talk to our our stakeholders about changing the date or the priority in order to make sure that we meet all of the requests that have been made of us. The doc epic is another important part of our toolkit. It includes operational details about the feature that is going to be released. We do planning with stakeholders, and what we produce from that planning is the different channels that we're going to be publishing to, and those are represented by the stories in the epic. So there's a story per publishing channel. We get information about what kind of business value we want to emphasize for this feature, and we estimate the t-shirt size based on a number of items, including the number of issues that are involved in publishing this content successfully. And so an extra small effort would be from a half day to a day, and an extra large effort, we just recently finished something that our first project that qualified as extra large took about 5 weeks worth of work to get it ready for production. And then our last and most important tool is our planning doc, aka the context bucket. It's a reference documentation for the entire reference document for the entire doc team, and I'll talk more about what that means in a minute. One of the most important things we do is we map the PM's business value of the feature to a natural language description of what's happening, and we do an evaluation, a written evaluation of the user workflow. So what an administrator needs to do to configure the feature, what the downstream user needs to do to use the feature successfully, and how that might affect the work of other users that are impacted by the change. The context bucket also is a place where we do a lot of our advanced work that doesn't require specific engineering information. So part of keeping our customers successful and happy is giving them some kind of heads up about the fact that something is about to change or some new feature is about to be released. And so we write a coming soon document that describes at a high level what business value we're offering, and also some basic information about how the product is going to change as a result. We have a tool that allows us to post in-app announcements when a deployment is completed, if it's something that's going to change the way that that our users use the product. We create a blog post. Again, that's a very high-level piece of content that's part of a digest that we publish every week. So we not only do we let customers know as soon as something goes to deployment, but we also publish this digest on the Monday, every Monday, and that summarizes everything that went into production in the previous week. And lastly, we create a details doc, which looks more like a traditional release notes format. It lists UI changes, system behavior changes, and even the documentation that we're changing as a result of the feature, so that a customer can have a skimmable list of the changes that were released as part of any deployment. And then lastly, the docs to edit part of this, and this is the document that I'm referring to as a context bucket. We also call a DTE, literally the docs to edit. And this is a content inventory and an audit. We start with which docs are likely to be affected by a feature and which related docs need to be evaluated to determine whether or not they'll be affected by a new feature. And as the engineering work continues, we start making specific edits to specific documents. We don't have a content management system, so we literally keep a list of edits in the DTE itself, and we manually make them after the feature goes into production. We also call the list as we acknowledge that something is not actually affected by the feature, and possibly just as importantly, we save these documents for the next time that this particular set of functionality is likely to be changed as a result of an engineering effort. And that means that our work is shortened as a result of that. So it's all part of the efficiency part of this. This is a visualization of what context buckets look like in terms of any particular doc assignment and how we put things into the buckets and shuffle our work based on availability of subject matter experts, based on whether or not there is a UX mock-up of the new feature, whether we have an environment available that we can refer to, when subject matter experts are available versus not available. Priority is all a part of how we move from one context bucket to the next. And the best part of the context bucket, as I said, is a reference document for the entire team. And basically, if you determine that you've got too much on your plate based on the priority and the deadlines that you're working under, then you hand the bucket to someone else. And it's a really smooth transition between writers as a result of that. The last thing I want to talk about is how important it is to build internal networks and cultivate relationships. I'm sure a lot of people on the phone are familiar with knowing how important documentation is to getting customers successful and realizing that some, possibly the majority of the engineers that you work with don't recognize that, and how frustrating that is, and really coming to work for SailPoint, and specifically on the cloud product. I was given the opportunity to make the case in a way that I never have before, and that has really changed my relationship with all of these other, and my team's relationship with all these other teams, and I think it's meaningful to point out that it was really sort of very incremental change and almost one person at a time in order to show the value that we were offering. And I just want to point out, I don't know if anybody caught on, but the theme here is that we are able to get DevOps to really help us out and delay deployments if we need to. Engineering and product management check in with us before a feature flag is turned on, and QA is also constantly checking in with us to make sure that we've got the information we need to make sure that the customers are successful. And this part of it really started with services and support, because an engineer made a minor change, what he perceived as a minor change to the UI, and got a huge reaction from customers. And the postmortem that we had about this resulted in a weekly sync meeting between the UI lead, the docs team, and services and support. And we literally come in and just tell them everything that we're working on and get their feedback about what kinds of things we need to focus on in order to make sure that our customers are successful. And we also spend a fair amount of time finding out from them what other struggles they're having or that their customers are having, and making sure that we can help solve those with the documentation. We've spent a lot of time treating their requests as priority items, and that really helped them become advocates for the docs with customers specifically. And they were able to see how having solid documentation was an important part of customer satisfaction, and that they could grow their organization and offer more to the customers as a result of having good docs that supported what they were already doing. We also do some sort of silly seeming things that actually seem to also have a big impact. We literally, if somebody calls us out on a JIRA ticket, we attach this gold star to the ticket to thank them for letting, and calls our attention to something on a JIRA ticket to let them know that we appreciate the fact that they were thinking of us. And we've absolutely seen a cascade of, or snowball effect there, where the more positive reinforcement we give people, the more likely they are to call our attention to things that are important and that are going to affect the customers and the as an after effect, services and support. So I want to conclude by just going over what I've talked about so far. I think that it's important to start now to learn what your company's plans are for the future, how deployments currently happen, and you might even start thinking about how you can track those now so that you've sort of got that muscle memory for as the pace starts to increase. I definitely recommend getting looped in a lot earlier to feature development and start building your understanding of the feature and the business value that the feature is offering sooner, and building documentation assets that help the customer be more successful, and also really help you think more about what the ripple effects are across your documentation set. And that's where the content strategy mindset really comes into play. And then again, building networks with customer-facing folks who can help you make the case for documentation, and then with engineers and DevOps who have insider information that are going to help you be successful. And then lastly, I want to just share with y'all that everything that we've done has been baby steps, and really just sort of making incremental adjustments with what we've been doing as time allows and as sort of ideas come to us. I would say that having the internal networks has really helped us think differently about the way that we approach the content, so that we can make this incremental adjustments, and that as your company ramps up toward continuous delivery, that you have a lot of opportunities to make small changes and just be more focused on adapting than on getting it perfect every time. And lastly, I have a few resources that you can refer to about continuous delivery and about content strategy that I recommend for understanding both these items. And that's pretty much it. So I guess I go here for questions. Okay, so I'm going to read these questions out and try to respond. Oh, okay, so Jane Wilson asks who is responsible for creating the initial doc request, doc team or dev team or PMs. So this is a newer part of our process, and our goal is to get non-doc writers to be the people creating the doc requests. We want people to be aware of the impacts of their work, and to include us in the process as soon as possible. We want to take the burden of what I like to refer to as scanning the horizon for these kinds of changes off of my team, so that we can focus more on delivering the quality content and less on trying to figure out whether something needs documentation. Emily Gooden asks, you get info from DevOps about which features are getting deployed on a particular date. I would have thought that both DevOps and you would get deployment info from a product owner or product manager. So again, I'm not a very technical person, but basically when something is ready to go into production, engineering cuts a code branch, puts it into the DevOps queue, and it sits in the queue until DevOps can get to it. So there is no date. There is a queue, and the queue gets processed automatically, and as things move up in the queue, then once they get to the top, then they get released into production. So, and again, I want to emphasize that there are a few items where we actually set a date. Primarily, something goes into the automated queue, and the sort of a DevOps ability to process that queue is when the code actually goes into production. Zora asks, does your doc team have the SMEs review the doc for feedback prior to the writer updating to accelerate continuous delivery? We do, as we finish any particular asset, we send it out for review. So a lot of the early stuff is more oriented towards product managers and services and support, actually more services and support. And so that content is reviewed by those subject matter experts as soon as we get it done. We do have a short turnaround on the final technical content as a result of trying to keep up with engineering. So like I said, as soon as engineering finishes with the product changes, we are at least, I would say a maximum of a couple days away from finishing the content changes. And then we send it out for review. We do have a quick turnaround on that stuff. And the good thing about that is that we use a cloud platform for our documentation. So if somebody finds a defect in the field, we can fix it immediately. So there's some reviewing that happens beforehand, and there's some reviewing that actually happens in the field. Phoebe asks, what are your deliverables? What format? So we use a cloud community platform. We're in the process of switching over to Lithium, and we produce like I said, a coming soon. We're using a discussion format for the coming soon content. In the community, we have a variety of documents that live in the community. We have the blog. We have an in-app tool that allows us to not only post an announcement as soon as something goes into production, but we also periodically create walkthroughs or light boxes that show up and help introduce new features. So hopefully that answers your question, Phoebe. Jamie asks, will these resources be emailed to us? I think I'm assuming you're asking about the web link or the URLs that I included on the last slide. Those are, I mean, I guess I wouldn't know. I'd have to ask Claudia about how we would get that information to y'all, but it is going to be on the recording that will be stored on the STC site. Let's see. Tasha asks, how was your content strategy developed, and was it the entire tech writing team that contributed to its development? So that is a really good question. I'm really, like I said, we're kind of, baby steps is the nice way of putting it. We're really just making things up as we go along, and I don't mean that in terms of like the actual content that our customers are using. We're just sort of trying to figure things out as we can. And yeah, I mean, the way that we approach the content has definitely been a collaborative effort from the whole team. I was the only writer for about 2.5 years, and so I did a bulk of that, but then everybody has been contributing since then. Phoebe asks, are the doc requests treated as dependencies? Like I said, it depends on whether we determine that the docs are going to prevent a customer or going to cause a customer to fall over. If they don't exist, in those cases, those would be treated as dependencies. Moira asks, how often are client impacting changes deployed? We don't have any good statistics on that. I would say that maybe once every couple of weeks we have 2 or 3 that come all at once, and then every other week we have smaller ones that come. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. Okay, Emily Gooden says, okay, thanks. Glad I answered your question. Sharon Metzger asks, can you talk a bit more about feature flags? You called a cloaking device where engineers, product check in with writers to see if we're ready. Is that a JIRA field? Who sets it? When in process? Who checks in, etc. So feature flags themselves are actually in the code, and there's a feature flag deployment ticket which tells DevOps when to turn a feature flag on or off. But the engineers are responsible for defining feature flags and then also identifying the components of their work that need to be hidden behind a feature flag. Let's see if I answered. So the JIRA, there is no JIRA field specifically for a feature flag, but if something is behind a feature flag, then the engineer, the lead, will create a feature flag ticket, and when that shows up in DevOps queue, then they will turn it on. And so basically what happens is engineering asks us if we're ready, and if we are, then they move it into the queue. Vicky asks, can you recommend a book on JIRA that explains tickets and the queues? I wish I could. I can't. The queue, JIRA itself really just allows you to create a variety of filters, and the filters, the queue that we created is just a filter that only shows IDN doc issues, and then we set the columns that are visible based on what we need in order to make our evaluations. JIRA in particular is something that I've really just learned on the fly as I needed to, as these things come up. Tasha asks, what challenges have you faced in using JIRA? Have you used other methods in the past to get the features that you turn into documentation? Prior to SailPoint, the company I worked at used Rally, and it was a pretty similar system for us in terms of tracking what kinds of documentation we needed and when to work on it. The difference was that it was not continuous deployment, so it was more, we were doing quarterly releases, and so it was just a less dynamic environment that we were working in. But I'm using the tools that help me interface with DevOps and engineering processes. I'm not choosing a tool that works best for me. I'm using a tool that helps me understand what engineering and DevOps are working on. Esther asks, what format do you use to push the updated documentation to customers? Do you ever use PDFs? We do not use PDFs. We use a lot of people refer to the platform we use as a wiki. It's a lot more intuitive to create content based on my experience with wikis using our platform than but it's basically like just URL links, and we can go in and edit a document anytime we need to. So there's no, the documents are live in production, and we either make incremental changes if it's something small, or we create a new version of the doc in our draft space, and we literally copy the HTML for the new content out of the draft doc and replace the existing HTML in the published document to get the new content to the customers. See, Tasha asks, what do you use to create release notes? We basically treat the blog as our release notes format, and so it's all using the same community formatting, and we use a subscription to the blog to distribute our release notes. So in order to get the information, you have to subscribe to the blog, and when we post a new blog post, then everybody who's subscribed gets that item. And then we use a tool called Pendo for our in-app notifications, and they have something called a what's new guide, and we create what's new guides that we can deliver. We basically have them waiting and staging, and as soon as we get a notification that a deployment happened, we flip the switch and turn it on to public, and that will show up for anybody who's actually using the product. And we usually have those have a lifespan of 2 weeks, because we have a lot of our customers are not in the product all the time. So they have basically a 2-week opportunity to see that this new feature was delivered to their production environment. And then we have coverage through the blog post, which will come out within 3 to 5 days from when the item went into production. The gold star is a PNG. Cami, asked, is the gold star just an icon you insert? No, it's a big old PNG, and we attach it to Jira tickets. We send it an email. And we actually have another version of that we call the Lifetime Achievement Award for people who've just gone out of their way multiple times to help us do our work. So it's big, and it's intentionally big. Esther asks, follow-up question, do you have more than one version of a product in production, and how do you handle content in this case? We do not, and that's actually an important part of continuous delivery and SaaS products in general. I mean, there are sort of cloud-hosted products where each customer has the opportunity to be on a different version, and we, for cost saving and efficiency purposes, do not do that. All customers are always on the same version, and that is a huge relief to us as writers. We don't exactly publish, let's see, Zora asks, do you publish online HTML help and PDFs as well? So our community content is HTML, but it's not sort of traditional online help. We do have some help links that we can connect our users to in the UI, but that just takes them into the community platform so that they can see all that content there. Sharon asks, do you have an internal staging environment to learn your new features and test Pindo guides? If so, any best practices to stay ahead of production releases? Sharon, that's an excellent question, and I don't have, we're still figuring that part out. We do get access to internal staging environments, and we do absolutely write our final content as a result of, oh dear, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just got a message from my phone that says my configuration is updating. This may cause the phone to reboot upon completion. So if I drop off, Claudia, I apologize. This is a new phone system. We just moved into a new building. You can still hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So engineering has the different Scrum teams have different environments for their work, and so we are able to get into those to finish the final content that we're going to be producing that actually has this sort of specific UI changes that are happening. It is interesting because the staging environment is usually specific to the individual tribes, or scrums, I should say. So sometimes we're not seeing the full ripple effects of the functionality because we're only seeing this limited set of changes made by this one tribe, and there's lots of things happening in conjunction with that. So having good communication within our own team to make sure that whatever features one writer is working on might impact another writer's work, that we're aware of all that. That looks like that's it for questions. Claudia or Scott, do you have any questions or final comments?
Scott, I don't know if you wanted to say anything.
I was going to say, I just would like to thank you for sharing and also for being daring, because it is awful daring to get on a phone system that's never been tested before and to do something that you probably haven't done as many times as some of us have. So you did a good job. Thank you for hurdling those technology challenges and pushing through the best that you could. I think you did a great job, and you shared lots of useful information. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to the STC for having both of us. It was great. I hope that the attendees got some value out of today's program and that you'll follow up with the Society for Technical Communication and continue following their efforts to promote these kind of topics. In fact, we'll be doing a couple more sessions throughout the month. And I know that the Society has some plans for some additional content throughout the year. So definitely spread the word and keep joining us each week as we produce new content designed to help you do better at work.
Great. Thank you all so much for attending today's webinar. A link to the evaluation survey will be emailed to you later today. If you do have any more questions that you have for Meredith, please go ahead and respond to that email and we'll get those to her. We do appreciate your feedback, and in the same email, there'll be a link to the recording of this webinar. So thank you again for the support of STC's online education program. Have a good day.